Good morning, Nerdvertariat. It is Monday, and today I am going to, in the vein of my video from the very first video I made for Secret Siblings, going to tell you about another really cool place in Minnesota. Mark and I actually went to this place on our honeymoon almost a month ago, and it is called Grim Portage. So why is it significant? Grim Portage was a trading hub for so many people. First, it was a trading hub for all of the native people who lived in that region, and they called it the Kichi Onigami, and that means the Great Carrying Place. And then the French, who would be the ones who would give it the name of Grim Portage, eventually then came here as well. And they came here for these guys, and they wanted these guys, these cute little beavers, so that they could have their pelts, so that they could make them into these fancy hats. And so then between 1696 and 1715, the French government revoked licenses and restricted trade to only eastern ports, which did not include Grim Portage. And so during this time, the tribes that were near Grim Portage began to rely completely on the English posts on the Hudson Bay to the north, which isn't terribly far away, but it is a whole lot farther away than Grim Portage was. So once the French government allowed traders to reestablish posts farther west, their strategy to compete with the British, who not only gave the local indigenous peoples higher quality goods in trade, they also gave them more stuff in terms or in exchange for their goods that they were giving them. Their strategy was to have home delivery, which essentially meant we're going to be closer and more convenient, even though our stuff is not as plentiful and sucks more in terms. So the Ojibwe people had a village at Grim Portage, and they acted as the middlemen for the French. And the French actually, over the time that they were here, they had quite a few different middlemen. The Ojibwe people lasted the longest, and the middlemen were essentially brokers. They were the people that established trade between the European peoples and all of the other tribes and native nations of the Americas and the region. And they helped them to actually do trade, because the Europeans were not exactly good at trading with the indigenous people, unfortunately. And so the French and the Ojibwe had a great thing going for them at Grim Portage for a long time, until in 1754 when the French and Indian War broke out. And so eventually the French would end up surrendering to Great Britain in 1760, and they gave up all the lands they used for trade in 1763, and they gave it to Great Britain. And then Great Britain, upon this, they're like, yes, we can go. We can get these sweet beavers that are in the Great Lakes region, which weren't called the Great Lakes region, but either way, we can get these beavers so we can have all of these fancy hats. Not realizing that the local people still were convinced that that the war was still going on, because in their minds, recompense had not been made for the war. One person that made the trip was Alexander Henry, and he ignored all of the Eastern Native Americans that warned him ahead of time and were like, don't go to this part because the Ojibwe are very loyal to the French and they will kill you. And he didn't listen to them. And upon arriving there, they told him, Englishman, you know that the French king is our father. He promised to be such, and we, in return, promised to be his children. This promise we have kept. You are his enemy. You know that his enemies are ours. Englishman, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods, and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. Your nation supposes that we, like the white people, cannot live without bread and pork and beef. But you ought to know that he, the great spirit and master of life, has provided food for us in these spacious lakes and on these woody mountains. Englishman, our father, the King of France, employed our young men to make war upon your nation. In this warfare, many of them have been killed, and it is our custom to retaliate until such a time as the spirits of the slain are satisfied. Englishmen, your king has never sent us any presents, nor entered into any treaty with us. Wherefore he and we are still at war. So this was rather significant because in Native American culture, when you entered into trade with people, you essentially entered into a kinship with them. They became your family. So by creating these trading alliances with the French, the Ojibwe people were saying, yes, we accept you as our family. And these obligations came. And the English did not realize that even though they'd made peace with the French, they did not actually make peace with the Native Americans of the region that the French had made these trade agreements with. Eventually, Great Britain did figure it out, and so in 1764, they sent ambassadors throughout the Great Lakes region to sue for peace. And during this time, the Northwest Company was established, and they held a trading post at Grim Portage for many years, until the American Revolution, which was partially fueled by the fur trade. The Quebec Act of 1774 essentially declared that the Ohio region was to only be allowed to be used by Native peoples and traders, and that the American colonists could not settle there, which made them upset. And it was actually in Great Britain's best interest to keep the lands that were a part of the fur trade as pristine as possible, because it was Canada's largest industry. However, as we all know, the Great Britain did lose to the colonies, and so upon that, they agreed to a boundary line that went right through the middle of the Great Lakes, which, if you take a look at the map, is still in place today. The border between Canada and the United States of America still goes through the middle of the Great Lakes. However, once we actually get to Grim Portage, we see the conundrum. See, Grim Portage is actually this lovely little green strip right here, which the reason why it's important is the Pigeon River, which is is the actual place where you can get into the part of America and connects to all of these lovely lakes. The Pigeon River is filled with a whole bunch of waterfalls and rapids and things that are not very accessible by boat. So the Native peoples created this 8.5-mile land connection where you could navigate and connect back up with the waterways that would then get you into all of these lakes that allow you to eventually actually get to anywhere that you really want to go. You can get up to Hudson Bay, you can get up to the Arctic Ocean, obviously via the Hudson Bay and whatnot. You can get to the Pacific Ocean, you can get to the Gulf of Mexico. You can get to just about anywhere, just because of the fact that there's all of these beautiful lakes in here that are really easy to navigate. And none of the portages are actually even that much longer than the Grim Portage, which once again is 8.5 miles long. The problem, though, is that, as you can see, the Grim Portage starts here, and this is where the border is. Grim Portage is 5 miles south. And this was actually a mistake. The British were given a map that was not, or that it was incorrect, and they assumed that the chain of border lakes that are in modern-day Minnesota and Ontario were navigable from Lake Superior. And they didn't realize that the Pigeon River was only accessible by the Grim Portage, and it was 5 miles south of the border. Now, this issue remained moot for many years since the American government was kind of a little bit busy and they didn't have time to worry about the British. However, it wouldn't stay a moot issue for long. 1796 brought Jay's Treaty, I can talk, and it essentially said British had to leave their ports that were south of the border. So they began desperately to search for a route that was north of the Pigeon River. And the local tribes pointed out the solution, which is what they called the Ministegue River to the north. And this river flows into modern-day Thunder Bay and Fort William. And the river itself, though, wasn't as ideal as the Pigeon River was because the Ministegue River is more of a series of brooks than an actual full river, and it meant the boats couldn't be filled as full, and it was a much longer voyage than the one by the Grim Portage. But the Northwest Company was kind of having their hands tied, and so they decided to move north to what eventually would become Fort William in modern-day Ontario. The local Ojibwe tribe did try to convince the Northwest Company from moving, stating that they claimed this country as their own and felt that they had the right to locate their traders wherever they pleased. And they didn't agree that Great Britain and the United States had any right to divide the land amongst themselves, as the land had been left to them, the Ojibwe people, by their ancestors. But the Northwest Company did hold its final rendezvous at the Grim Portage in 1802, and upon leaving, they destroyed their forts and warehouses. And it's thought that many of the buildings were actually dismantled and then brought up to the new Fort William location. And the Northwest Company did for a few years keep some employees at the Grim Portage, but by 1822, the Grim Portage was completely abandoned. Nowadays, you can go to Grim Portage. They did recreate it. They restored some things, and there is a historical reenactment there. It is really cool. There's a whole lot more history than I was actually able to cover of the Grim Portage, but I'm probably completely out of time. I will include links to my sources in the doobly-doo, including one absolutely amazing free online resource that you can read called The Grim Portage Story, and it goes much farther into everything. It's a really fascinating area, and if you're ever in the area, you should totally check it out. In the meantime, though, I will see you guys again tomorrow on Tuesday with, I should remember this, Salamanda. So in the meantime, though, don't forget to be awesome. Right, Bert? Right, Bert?